I was just
All right. As always, you guys are a little bit ahead, so we're going to be recording this class today. We only have one more slide. Somebody want to tell me real quick what the difference between an executive agreement and a treaty is?
Executive agreement is like an agreement between like multiple executives. Like they don't need the people. You don't need full Congress.
There you go. An executive agreement is an informal agreement that does not need congressional approval between the heads of one or more executive branches. Okay? What's a treaty?
On paper.
Usually written down, and it usually requires congressional approval. Okay? So, just a heads up, executive agreements are generally dealing with military action because executive branches are always in charge. Because if you read our Constitution, Congress is in charge of our economics. All right? Any questions so far? Just a little quick review of what we did yesterday. The other things we talked about were informal changes to the Constitution, right? Take a look at your notes real quick. So when I ask you this, you can give me an answer. So take a look at your notes. So you can answer when I ask you a question. In what way has Congress changed the Constitution informally? And I'm going to ask you about the executive branches. All right. What has Congress done that maybe they didn't necessarily have the explicit power to do?
Tax laws.
Yeah. What about the tax laws? They have the power to levy taxes, but it doesn't say they have the power to create the complex tax laws that we have in place now. But the Constitution has been interpreted to give them those powers. Okay?
I thought I guessed this.
We talked about it yesterday. It should be under informal changes and changes through law, right? And then what about the executive branch? What's happened to the executive branch that informally changed the Constitution? Has to deal with William Henry Harrison.
Oh yeah.
It's that guy right there. If you could look at him. The death in office.
Oh, okay.
He died in office, but what happened after he died in office?
It's fighting with Vice President.
Yeah, John Tyler, vice president, took over as president. No one knew what to do, so we just did it. So that was an informal change. And we're going to get to one more set of informal changes through the Supreme Court today. So we're shifting to the judicial branch. And you're welcome. This is the very last slide, so there's quite a bit on it. Main function of the Supreme Court is to declare laws and actions of the government constitutional or unconstitutional. We've learned this. This isn't new information. Thus, making their interpretation arguably the most important. Okay, this is just a little review. We learned this before today. So what the Supreme Court has to say about the Constitution is the final word. That's it. But what we haven't learned are the two major opinions among citizens of how a Supreme Court should interpret the Constitution. So let me ask the whole question before you raise your hand, and I do want you to raise your hand after I'm done. How many of you think the Constitution should be taken exactly as it is, word for word, or do you think that the Constitution should be open to interpretation and cover things that aren't necessarily word for word in the Constitution? All right, so if you think it should only be word for word what's in the Constitution, raise your hand. So, yeah. How many of you think that they should be able to interpret it and cover things that, okay. So all of you would fall under the category of judicial activism. Okay, these are the two major ones. And we'll talk about activism since that seems to be the predominant opinion here. This believes that courts should play a role in social and political issues in shaping national policy. An example of judicial activism, the one that keeps coming up and that I continue to use only because it's the most recent event in Supreme Court judicial activism, was same-sex marriage this past summer. Nowhere in the Constitution does it address marriage. Anyway, but the Constitution has been interpreted by the Supreme Court to cover marriage as something that is protected under the 14th Amendment. What a lot of people don't know from that ruling is that it protected the right to marry for all individuals as well. So, not that it's ever happened, but it also prohibits the banning of marriage between any two adults, whether it's straight or same-sex. But there are some people that believe in what's called judicial restraint. This is where courts should avoid taking the initiative on social and political issues, should uphold acts of Congress unless they directly violate the Constitution. These marriage. It doesn't say it in the Constitution federally. So according to the 10th Amendment, that goes to the states. You shouldn't be able to rule on it. So the Supreme Court would simply say this is out of our jurisdiction. We can't rule on it. They wouldn't say yes. They would not say no. Now, the exception being obviously if something directly violates the Constitution. For example, Congress makes a law respecting one religion universally. They would expect the Supreme Court to strike that down because it says it in the Constitution. There shall be no law respecting the establishment of an official religion. Judicial restraint, it should interpret the Constitution exactly as it is. Judicial activism, they're open to interpret the Constitution to cover other aspects of society. The very last thing we need to get down today. The Supreme Court has changed its mind on rulings depending on the times. This is another way to informally change the Constitution. Here's an example. In 1896, a ruling that allowed separate but equal was later reversed in 1954. All right, if you care, the ruling in 1896 was Plessy versus Ferguson. It was a Supreme Court ruling that said you are allowed to segregate as long as the facilities being provided are of equal caliber and quality to each category or each race. This was not the case. So 58 years later, 1954, there was a Supreme Court case that you've all heard of, Brown versus Board of Education. And this ruling struck down separate but equal, saying it was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment, since those facilities were not equal. So, I'll say it again. This is a way that the Supreme Court can informally change the Constitution by simply changing its mind or interpreting the Constitution differently. Because you're going to need to know that to your assessment today. Can anyone else think of an example of the Supreme Court changing its mind?
Prohibition have to do Supreme Court?
It did not. It did not. But that's a good example of the people. It actually created a huge outpouring of people voting that had never voted before. So when the 18th Amendment passed, a lot of people didn't vote. It was something like 28 or 31% voter turnout, which would be low by today's standards. People didn't think it would pass, and all of a sudden it did. They're like, oh, this sucks. So they went through the proper channels, elected the right people, passed it. We proposed it. and then we ratified it through those special constitutional conventions, the 21st Amendment. So that's a good example of people. And then the voter turnout on that was close to 60%, which is very high by today's standards. Does anybody know on average what percentage of registered voters come out and vote during a presidential election? And this is the highest numbers we have for any election is presidential. It's like 38% of registered voters actually vote for president. 38%. It's wild, isn't it?
Less than half.
A lot less than that. It's closer to a third.
Yeah.
All right. Any questions over this stuff?
No.
That's all she wrote. You're done. All right. So hang tight for a second. I'll give you your assessment.